If you are hearing this right now, stop for a second, because what I am about to say was never meant to reach just anyone. And yet somehow it reached you at the exact moment you were not expecting anything to change. Something about this feels unusual, almost like a pause in your thoughts that you did not create yourself. Like the noise of your day suddenly stepped back for a reason you cannot explain. You might not realize it yet, but this is not random timing. And the weight you feel right now in your chest is not just stress or exhaustion from another long day. It is the kind of moment that makes everything else feel distant for a second, like your mind is trying to catch up with something your heart already sensed before you did. You could have been anywhere else right now, scrolling past something else, thinking about something else, but instead you are here, and that alone carries more meaning than it seems. Think back for a moment to earlier today, maybe when you were sitting in silence in your car for a few minutes longer than usual, or when you looked at your phone and realized no message came from the person you were waiting on, or when you tried to distract yourself, but the same thought kept returning without explanation. That pattern you have been living in lately, the waiting, the unanswered questions, the quiet frustration of things not moving no matter how much effort you put in, it is not as disconnected as it feels. There is a deeper thread running through it, even if you cannot see where it leads yet. And right now, in this exact moment, it feels like something is trying to get your attention, not through noise, not through chaos, but through stillness, through the kind of silence that forces you to notice what you normally ignore. You may have started to believe that certain things just stopped working for you, that doors closed without reason, or that timing simply has not been on your side lately. But what if the meaning behind all of it is not what you assumed at all? What if what felt like distance was actually something unfolding in a direction you were not meant to understand immediately? There are moments in life where nothing loud happens, no clear sign appears, yet everything inside you begins to shift in ways you cannot fully name. And this might be one of those moments. Even the way you ended up here feels different, like a sequence of small decisions that led you to something you did not plan to see. Stay with this feeling for a moment longer, because what comes next will start to connect pieces you thought were unrelated, and the silence you have been questioning may not be silence at all, but something else entirely beginning to reveal itself in a way you were never prepared for. And as you continue to sit with that feeling, something subtle begins to surface, not as a loud answer, but as a quiet recognition that makes your thoughts slow down without warning. It is almost like your memory is trying to replay moments you did not think were important at the time, small fragments of your recent days that now feel strangely connected. You might remember waking up in the middle of the night and staring at the ceiling for no clear reason, not feeling fear exactly, but a kind of heaviness that made it hard to return to sleep. You might recall sitting in your car in a parking lot for a few extra minutes, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel, wondering why everything in your life feels like it is moving except the things you care about most. And even if you tried to dismiss those moments as stress or fatigue, there was something about them that lingered longer than usual, something you could not easily explain. In fact, even earlier today there may have been a moment where you checked your phone, saw nothing new, and yet felt like you were waiting for something you could not name, as if your mind already knew there was an unfinished thread in your life that had not been resolved. And here is what makes it even more unsettling in a quiet way, because none of those moments felt connected when you lived them, but now they seem to form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. It is like pieces of a picture you did not know you were looking at are slowly aligning without your permission. You may have even started to wonder lately if you did something wrong, if you missed an opportunity, or if you were somehow stuck in a place where progress no longer responds to effort. That thought might not be loud in your mind, but it has been sitting underneath your decisions, influencing how you react, how you wait, and how you interpret silence from others. Yet there is another layer to this that you may not have considered, because sometimes what feels like nothing happening is actually something happening in a way that does not announce itself. There are seasons where clarity does not arrive through explanation, but through delay, through pauses that feel uncomfortable because they force you to face what you cannot control. And in those pauses, you begin to notice things you normally overlook, like how your expectations change when nothing confirms them, or how your emotions become more visible when distractions are removed. Even the absence of answers starts to speak in a way that feels intentional rather than accidental. It is almost as if the silence around certain situations has been guiding your attention inward, not to punish your uncertainty, but to reveal how deeply you have been trying to hold everything together on your own. And while it may not make full sense yet, there is a growing realization forming underneath all of this, that what you have been calling delay might not be empty time at all, but something unfolding at a pace you were never meant to force or fully understand in the moment. Stay with that thought, because what comes next begins to shift the meaning of everything you thought was simply not working. And now, as you sit with those thoughts forming in the background of your mind, something begins to shift in the way you remember your own experiences, almost as if the same moments you once dismissed are starting to carry a different meaning than they did before. It is not that anything new has happened externally, but rather the way you are seeing everything begins to subtly rearrange itself, like your understanding is catching up to something your emotions already felt but never fully acknowledged. You might think back again to the past few weeks and notice how certain things did not just happen once, but repeated in different forms, almost like patterns you did not recognize at the time because you were too focused on trying to move forward. There may have been moments where you expected a response that never came, or situations where you felt like you were about to step into something new, only for it to pause without explanation. At the time, each moment felt separate, unrelated, even random, but now there is a growing sense that they may not have been random at all. And what makes this even more difficult to dismiss is how your internal reaction to those moments was often stronger than the events themselves, as if something inside you was already trying to interpret meaning before you had the language to understand it. You might remember telling yourself to be patient, to wait, to trust that things would eventually make sense, but at the same time feeling a quiet resistance inside, a tension between what you were hoping for and what was actually unfolding. That tension is important because it reveals that you were never fully at peace with simply calling everything coincidence. There was always a part of you that felt there was more beneath the surface, even when you tried to ignore it and move on. And now, as these memories begin to align in your awareness, it becomes harder to see them as isolated events. Instead, they start to resemble a sequence that has been unfolding gradually, without urgency, without noise, but with a consistency that is difficult to deny once you notice it. Even the emotional weight you carried during those moments begins to feel different in hindsight, not just as frustration or confusion, but as something that kept redirecting your attention back to the same unanswered space in your life. It is as if every delay, every silence, every unfinished expectation was pulling you toward a point you have not yet reached, but have been approaching all along without realizing it. And in that realization, there is a subtle discomfort because it challenges the way you normally define progress, success, and timing. You are used to seeing movement as proof that things are working, but here you are being confronted with the possibility that stillness itself may have been part of a different kind of movement, one that does not announce itself, but shapes you quietly over time. And even if you cannot fully understand where this leads yet, you cannot easily dismiss the sense that something has been guiding your attention through these experiences in a way that is not accidental, but intentional in its own quiet form. And as that sense of quiet meaning continues to settle inside your awareness, something more personal begins to surface, something that does not come from outside of you, but from the way you have been reacting to your own life, without fully understanding why. It is almost as if your internal world has been holding questions that your external world never directly answered, and now those questions are beginning to rise again with a different kind of clarity. You might notice how recently, even in ordinary moments, there has been a subtle hesitation in your decisions, like you were waiting for something to confirm itself before you fully moved forward. Not because you were afraid, but because a part of you felt like something important was still unfinished, even if you could not define what that was. And in that space of uncertainty, you may have found yourself reflecting more than usual, revisiting choices you made, conversations you had, and paths you did not take, almost as if your mind was trying to locate a missing piece that would explain the feeling you could not shake. What is interesting is that this reflection did not bring immediate answers, but instead brought more awareness of how often things in your life have shifted direction without warning. Situations that once seemed stable slowly changed, not through dramatic events, but through small adjustments that only made sense later when you looked back. And while you were living through those moments, you likely labeled them as inconvenience, bad timing, or simple uncertainty. because that is the most logical way the mind tries to protect itself from ambiguity. But now, sitting in this expanded awareness, there is a different interpretation beginning to form, one that suggests those changes were not simply interruptions, but transitions you were not prepared to recognize at the time. Even the emotional reactions you had during those transitions begin to look different now, because they were not just reactions to external events, but responses to an internal expectation that something else should have been happening, something you were waiting for without fully realizing you were waiting. And that creates a kind of quiet conflict within you, because part of you still wants to categorize everything as coincidence, while another part of you cannot ignore the consistency behind it all. You may also start to recognize how certain periods in your life felt like pauses that extended longer than expected, where effort did not seem to translate into visible change no matter how consistent you were. In those periods, you likely questioned your direction, your timing, and even your own judgment, trying to understand why momentum seemed to disappear just when you expected it to build. Yet in hindsight, those same pauses appear less like empty gaps and more like intervals where something was being adjusted beneath the surface of your experience in ways you were not able to observe in real time. And the more you consider it, the more you begin to sense that your frustration was not only about what was not happening, but about the lack of explanation for why it was not happening. That absence of explanation is what made the experience feel heavier than it needed to be, because the human mind naturally seeks meaning even in silence. And now, as you continue to sit with this unfolding awareness, there is a growing realization that perhaps the absence itself was not empty at all, but quietly shaping the way you understand timing, patience, and direction in a way you were never meant to fully grasp in the moment. And now, as you stay with these thoughts a little longer, something deeper begins to rise beneath the surface of everything you have been reflecting on, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow internal shift in the way you interpret your own story. It is almost as if the same events you once measured by frustration or confusion are now being seen through a different lens, one that does not immediately explain everything, but instead challenges the way you defined meaning in the first place. You may begin to notice how often your expectations were shaped by timing you could see, by results you could measure, by outcomes that arrived within a predictable frame. And because of that, anything that did not follow that structure felt like something had gone wrong, even when nothing obvious was actually breaking. Yet as you continue to trace back through your recent experiences, there is a growing awareness that not everything in your life has ever moved in a straight line. And in fact, some of the most important shifts you experienced only became clear after you had already moved past them. That realization alone begins to create a subtle tension in your understanding, because it suggests that clarity does not always arrive in the moment you need it, but often appears only after distance has formed. And within that distance, you start to recognize patterns that were invisible when you were still inside them. You might recall situations where something you wanted very strongly did not arrive, and at the time it felt like a direct blockage, a clear absence of progress, something that simply did not happen. But now, as you revisit it with a quieter mind, you begin to see that what did not happen may have quietly redirected you away from something you were not ready to fully understand or handle. This is where the internal conflict becomes more noticeable, because one part of you still wants to define those moments as missed opportunities, while another part of you is beginning to question whether that interpretation was ever complete. And in that space between those two interpretations, something unfamiliar begins to form, not an answer, but a different way of holding uncertainty without immediately turning it into failure. You may also start to notice how certain emotional reactions you had in those moments were not only about what was happening externally, but about the pressure of needing everything to make sense immediately. That pressure created its own kind of urgency, a quiet demand for explanation that reality did not always provide. And when explanation did not come, silence filled that space, not as emptiness, but as unresolved meaning that lingered longer than you expected. Over time, that unresolved feeling may have shaped the way you approached new situations, making you more cautious, more reflective, or even more uncertain about whether to trust what you could not immediately confirm. Yet now, as these layers begin to unfold in your awareness, there is a subtle shift happening, where silence itself no longer feels like absence, but more like an unfinished sentence that you are still in the process of understanding. And even though you may not have a final conclusion yet, there is a quiet recognition forming that not every delay in your life was a sign of something missing, but possibly part of a sequence that only becomes visible when you stop expecting it to explain itself immediately. And as this quiet shift continues unfolding within your awareness, something even more delicate begins to surface, something that does not arrive as a conclusion, but as a deeper emotional alignment with everything you have been carrying without fully naming it. It is almost as if your inner world has reached a point where it can no longer separate what you felt from what you experienced, and the two begin to merge into a single stream of understanding that feels both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. You may notice how certain memories now carry a different emotional tone than they did before, not because the events themselves have changed, but because your interpretation of them is no longer anchored only in the immediate feeling you had when they happened. There is a kind of emotional recalibration taking place, where moments that once felt like frustration or confusion now begin to feel like signals pointing towards something you were not able to perceive in real time. And within that recalibration, you might start to sense how often your life has moved through phases where clarity was intentionally delayed, not in a way you could control or predict, but in a way that only becomes visible after enough distance has formed to see the full shape of it. That realization does not remove the uncertainty, but it changes your relationship with it, because uncertainty is no longer just an absence of answers, but a space where meaning may have been forming quietly all along. You may recall times when you were convinced that something should have progressed faster, when you believed that effort should have produced immediate results, and when the lack of visible movement made you question whether anything was working at all. But now, looking back through this evolving perspective, those same moments begin to appear less like failures of progress and more like intervals where your expectations were being reshaped without your awareness. And that can feel uncomfortable because it challenges the assumption that progress must always be visible in order to be real. Yet the more you sit with this idea, the more you begin to recognize that some of the most significant internal changes you have experienced did not announce themselves while they were happening, but only became clear after you had already passed through them. There is also a deeper emotional layer beginning to emerge, where you start to understand how much energy you may have spent trying to force clarity in situations that were not ready to reveal themselves yet. That effort, while understandable, created its own form of tension because it placed pressure on moments that were still in formation, like trying to read a sentence before it has been fully written. And when that clarity did not arrive, the silence that followed felt heavier than it actually was, because it carried the weight of your expectations rather than the truth of the situation itself. Now, as you continue to observe this pattern from a slightly greater distance, you may begin to notice that what you once interpreted as stagnation might have actually been a form of hidden progression, unfolding in a way that did not align with your immediate perception, but still followed a consistent direction beneath the surface. And even though you cannot yet see the full structure of that direction, there is a quiet sense beginning to form that nothing you have lived through has been completely disconnected, and that even the moments you questioned most deeply may have been part of a sequence you are still in the process of understanding. And now, as this deeper awareness continues to unfold within you, there is a subtle but noticeable shift in the way your mind begins to organize everything you have been reflecting on, almost as if the scattered pieces are no longer staying separate the way they used to. It is not a sudden realization, but more like a gradual internal alignment, where the same experiences that once felt random now begin to echo each other in a way that is difficult to ignore. You may find yourself thinking again about specific moments where you felt ignored or overlooked, not in isolation, but as part of a repeating pattern that shows up in different areas of your life. Perhaps it was a situation where you waited for clarity from someone and it never came, or a moment where you expected movement in your circumstances but instead experienced continued stillness. At the time, each of those moments felt like a separate frustration, but now they begin to feel like variations of the same underlying experience, as if life was repeatedly placing you in situations where the outcome was not meant to be immediately visible. And within that recognition, something else begins to surface, a quiet internal question that does not demand an answer, but simply stays with you. asking whether the meaning you assigned to those moments was ever complete. You might also begin to notice how your emotional response in those situations often carried more weight than the situation itself, because it was not only about what was happening externally, but about the expectation that something should have been different. That expectation created a kind of tension between what you saw and what you believed should have been happening, and that tension may have shaped how you interpreted the entire experience. Yet now, as you observe it from a slightly different emotional distance, there is a growing awareness that not every absence of movement was actually a lack of direction. Some of what felt like nothing happening may have been a process that simply did not match your timing or your need for immediate understanding. And that creates a subtle, internal conflict, because part of you still wants to define those moments as unfinished or unresolved, while another part of you is beginning to see them as part of something that was unfolding beyond your immediate perception. You may even start to recognize how often your attempts to force clarity were met with more confusion, not because clarity was impossible, but because it was not arriving in the form you expected it to take. And that realization slowly shifts the emotional weight of those memories, not by removing them, but by changing the way they sit within your understanding. What once felt like contradiction now begins to feel like layering, where different meanings exist at different levels of the same experience. And as this layering becomes more apparent, there is a quiet sense emerging that your story has never been as fragmented as it once felt, but instead has been moving through a structure that only becomes visible when you stop trying to interpret every moment as final, and instead allow it to exist as part of something still in progress. And as this deeper layer of understanding continues to settle within your awareness, something begins to shift again, not in what you are thinking, but in how those thoughts are starting to connect without effort, as if your mind is no longer forcing meaning, but allowing it to appear in its own time. It is a subtle transition, almost unnoticeable at first, where the same memories you have revisited begin to feel less like separate events and more like reflections of a single unfolding pattern that you were moving through without recognizing it in real time. You might notice how certain moments now stand out more clearly than others, not because they were louder when they happened, but because they now seem to carry a different weight when viewed together. For example, there may have been times when you felt an unexpected pause in your progress, where something you expected to develop suddenly slowed down without explanation. And at the time it felt like a disruption, something that broke your momentum in a way you could not control. But now, as you continue to reflect, that disruption begins to look less like interruption and more like separation from a path that was not fully aligned with what came next. And within that shift in perspective, there is a quiet realization forming that what you once interpreted as blockage may have actually been a redirection that did not reveal its purpose until much later. This creates a kind of internal contradiction, because one part of you still holds the emotional memory of frustration, of waiting without answers, of feeling like nothing was moving despite your effort, while another part of you is beginning to see those same moments as part of a larger sequence that did not operate according to immediate visibility. And that contradiction does not resolve itself quickly, but instead sits within you, asking you to hold both interpretations at the same time without forcing one to cancel the other. You may also begin to recognize how often your strongest emotional reactions came from the gap between expectation and outcome, rather than the outcome itself. That gap created tension that shaped how you experienced time, making certain periods feel longer, heavier, and more uncertain than they may appear in hindsight. Yet as you revisit those same periods now, there is a growing awareness that the absence of immediate clarity did not necessarily mean absence of direction. Instead, it may have been a form of unfolding that required distance before it could be understood, a process that did not announce its purpose while it was happening, but instead revealed its structure only after enough pieces had already moved into place. And even though you are still in the middle of that understanding, there is a subtle but undeniable sense beginning to form that nothing you have lived through has been isolated, and that even the moments you once labeled as delay or silence may have been part of a continuous movement that only becomes visible when you stop measuring it by the standards of immediate explanation. And as you continue to hold all of these thoughts together, something deeper begins to surface, not as a new idea, but as a shift in how you are now able to look back at everything without immediately reacting to it the way you once did. It is almost as if your awareness has moved slightly above the timeline of your own experiences, allowing you to see connections that were always present but never fully visible when you were inside the moment. You may notice how certain events in your life now feel less like isolated chapters and more like chapters that were intentionally written to influence what came after them, even if you could not recognize that structure while you were living through it. There may have been moments where something ended unexpectedly. A situation you thought would continue suddenly stopped, and at the time it created confusion because there was no clear explanation to support the change. But now, as you revisit that memory, you begin to sense that the ending itself may have been doing more than simply closing a door. It may have been creating space for something that was not yet visible in your awareness. And within that realization, there is a subtle but powerful internal shift, because it challenges the assumption that every conclusion must come with immediate understanding. You might also begin to recognize how often your interpretation of events depended on timing, where something only felt meaningful if its purpose was revealed quickly enough to match your expectations. When that did not happen, the mind naturally labeled it as delay or uncertainty, even if the underlying process was still moving forward in ways that were not immediately measurable. And now, as you reflect on that pattern, there is a growing awareness that what you once defined as unanswered situations may have actually been unfolding in layers, each one only becoming visible after the previous one had already passed. This creates a quiet but significant shift in perception, because it suggests that meaning was never absent, only delayed in its visibility. And that delay, which once felt like a gap, now begins to feel more like a separation between experience and understanding, where one must move ahead of the other in order for clarity to eventually form. You may even start to notice how your emotional responses during those times were shaped more by uncertainty than by the actual events themselves, as if your mind was trying to resolve something before it had all the necessary pieces. That effort created tension, because it placed pressure on situations that were still in motion, expecting them to resolve before they were ready to reveal their direction. Yet as you continue to observe this from a more distant perspective, there is a quiet recognition forming that not everything in your life was meant to be understood at the exact moment it occurred. Some experiences required distance, not because they lacked meaning, but because their meaning depended on what came after them. And now, standing within this growing awareness, you may begin to sense that what once felt like unfinished chapters may have actually been carefully positioned parts of a sequence that only becomes fully visible when you stop trying to read each moment in isolation and instead allow the entire progression to speak for itself. And now, as all of this begins to settle into a deeper layer of understanding within you, something unexpected happens in the way your thoughts start to organize themselves, almost as if the pressure to solve everything at once has finally loosened its grip. It is not that everything suddenly becomes clear, but rather that the need for immediate clarity begins to lose its intensity, allowing space for a different kind of awareness to emerge. You may notice how certain questions you were holding so tightly start to feel less urgent, not because they have been answered, but because your relationship with them is quietly changing. Instead of demanding resolution from every situation, you begin to observe how those situations have already influenced you in ways you did not recognize at the time. And in that observation, there is a subtle but important shift, because it reveals that meaning was never only located in outcomes, but also in the process you move through while waiting for those outcomes to appear. You might recall how strongly you once reacted to uncertainty, how every delay felt like a disruption that needed correction, and how every silence felt like a gap that should have been filled. But now, as you revisit those same experiences from this slightly expanded perspective, there is a growing realization that the urgency you once felt may have been shaped more by expectation than by actual absence. And that realization does not remove the discomfort, but it changes its function, because what once felt like something going wrong now begins to feel like something that resisted premature definition. There may have been moments in your life where you believed you were on the edge of something finally coming together, only to experience a sudden pause that made no logical sense at the time. And in those moments, your mind likely filled the silence with interpretation, trying to assign meaning before the full picture had time to reveal itself. Yet now, as you look back across those same points in your timeline, you may begin to see how often those pauses appeared right before shifts you did not anticipate, even if you only understood them afterward. That pattern creates a kind of internal tension, because it challenges the assumption that timing must always be linear or immediately understandable in order to be meaningful. And as that tension settles, something more subtle begins to form underneath it. A quiet acknowledgement that not everything you were waiting for was meant to arrive in the form or sequence you expected. Some experiences required you to pass through them without full explanation, not because explanation was absent, but because it was not yet ready to be seen from the position you were in at the time. And now, as you continue to sit with this unfolding awareness, there is a growing sense that what once felt like uncertainty may have been a necessary condition for you to eventually see the connections that were always there, waiting for distance to make them visible. And as this deeper level of understanding continues to unfold within you, something begins to shift in a way that is less about new information and more about a new capacity to hold everything you have already been through without needing to immediately resolve it. It is almost as if your mind is beginning to step back just enough to see your own experiences with a wider perspective, where individual moments no longer demand instant interpretation, but instead begin to form a larger emotional landscape. You may notice how the same memories that once created tension when you thought about them are now becoming easier to observe without the same urgency to assign meaning right away. There is a subtle but significant change happening internally, where your awareness is no longer trying to force conclusions, but instead allowing patterns to exist without interruption. And within that shift, something deeper begins to emerge, a quiet recognition that not every unanswered situation in your life was meant to remain unresolved, but rather that resolution often arrives only when your perspective has expanded enough to receive it. You might find yourself reflecting again on how often you interpreted silence as absence, or delay as failure, or uncertainty as something being wrong, when in reality those experiences may have been operating on a different timeline than the one you were measuring them against. And now, as you revisit those same interpretations, there is a growing awareness that what you once labeled as lack of direction may have actually been direction that was not yet visible from your position. This realization does not erase the emotional weight you carried during those times, but it does begin to reshape what that weight means, because it suggests that your experience was not defined by randomness, but by a structure that only becomes recognizable in hindsight. And in that recognition, there is a quiet internal tension that forms, because it challenges the assumption that understanding must always come first in order for something to be meaningful. You may also begin to notice how certain parts of your journey only started making sense after you had already moved beyond them, almost as if clarity required distance in order to fully form. That pattern, once seen, becomes difficult to unsee because it repeats across different areas of your life in ways that feel too consistent to dismiss. And as this awareness deepens, there is a subtle shift in how you relate to your own past, where instead of viewing certain moments as unfinished or incomplete, you begin to see them as parts of a sequence that were never meant to reveal their purpose immediately. Even the emotional resistance you once felt toward uncertainty begins to soften slightly, not because the uncertainty is gone, but because your interpretation of it is no longer fixed in one direction. And now, as you continue to sit with this unfolding perspective, there is a growing sense that what you once experienced as confusion may have been the beginning stage of a deeper understanding that required time, distance, and reflection before it could fully reveal itself in a way you could finally recognize. And as you continue to remain within this deeper state of reflection, something begins to settle in a way that feels quieter than before, not because the thoughts are disappearing, but because they are no longer demanding immediate resolution in the same way they once did. It is almost as if your internal perspective has shifted from trying to solve your past to simply observing how your past has already been shaping you in ways that only become clear over time. You may notice how certain emotional patterns that once felt overwhelming now appear more stable when viewed from this distance, as if the intensity has softened enough for you to see structure where before there was only confusion. And within that shift, there is a growing awareness that what you once interpreted as unanswered questions may not have been waiting for resolution at all, but instead waiting for you to reach a version of yourself capable of understanding them differently. You might begin to recognize how often your need for immediate clarity created pressure around situations that were still unfolding, making them feel more uncertain than they actually were. And now, as you revisit those same situations, there is a subtle realization forming that the meaning was not missing, but simply distributed across time in a way that could not be accessed all at once. This creates a quiet but important internal change, because it challenges the idea that understanding must arrive at the same speed as experience in order to be valid. Instead, you begin to see how experience and understanding often move at different rhythms, with understanding arriving later to gather what experience has already lived through. And in that space between the two, something begins to feel less fragmented than it once did, as if your story has always contained more coherence than you were able to recognize while you were inside it. You may also notice how your emotional responses to past uncertainty begin to shift, not because the events themselves have changed, but because your interpretation of those events is no longer fixed in the same way. What once felt like delay now begins to feel like spacing, where moments were not missing connection, but simply separated in a way that only makes sense when viewed as a whole. And even though there is still no final explanation for every moment you have experienced, there is a growing sense that explanation itself is no longer the only form of understanding available to you. Instead, there is an emerging acceptance that some meanings are revealed gradually, not through sudden clarity, but through accumulated perspective. And as this awareness continues to deepen, you may begin to feel that what once seemed like unresolved tension was actually the early stage of integration, where everything you went through was quietly moving toward a version of understanding that could only exist after enough time had passed to let all the pieces settle into place. And now, as everything you have been reflecting on reaches this quieter and more settled space within your awareness, there is a final shift taking place, not in the form of new information, but in the way all of this begins to rest inside you without resistance. It is almost as if your mind, after going through layer after layer of interpretation, has stopped trying to separate meaning into pieces and has started allowing it to exist as a whole experience instead of something that needs constant explanation. You may notice how the urgency that once accompanied your thoughts has softened, not because the questions have disappeared, but because they no longer feel like they require immediate resolution in order to be meaningful. And in that softening, there is a deeper kind of clarity emerging, one that does not rely on sudden answers, but on the quiet acceptance that understanding can arrive gradually without losing its value. You might begin to recognize how much energy you once spent trying to force certainty onto situations that were still in motion, and how that effort shaped the way you experience time itself, making some moments feel heavier and more unfinished than they may have actually been. Yet now, as you look back across everything you have carried, there is a growing sense that nothing you went through was ever truly disconnected, even if it appeared that way when you were still inside it. Instead, there is a subtle awareness forming that your experiences have been continuously building toward a level of understanding that only becomes visible when you stop trying to force every moment into immediate meaning. And within that awareness, something important begins to settle, a quiet recognition that your story has not been defined by randomness, but by a gradual unfolding that required patience, distance, and reflection before its shape could be seen more clearly. You may also notice how your emotional relationship with uncertainty itself has begun to change, not because uncertainty is gone, but because it no longer holds the same weight it once did. What once felt like confusion begins to feel more like transition, and what once felt like absence begins to feel more like space that allowed other parts of your life to quietly take form. And even though there is still no single explanation that ties everything together in a simple way, there is a deeper sense of coherence beginning to emerge, not as something that is explained to you, but as something you can now feel more steadily from within. It is a kind of understanding that does not need to resolve every detail in order to feel complete, because it is no longer built on immediate answers, but on accumulated perspective. And as this perspective continues to settle, there is a final quiet realization forming that what you once experienced as delay, silence, or uncertainty may have been the very conditions that allowed you to arrive at this moment of awareness, where nothing is forced, nothing is rushed, and everything is finally allowed to exist as part of a larger unfolding that you are still gently becoming aware of.